Many thanks for your nice introduction. I would like to, thank the organizers, especially Neil and Lorenzo, for having me today for this lecture. For me, it's a great honor and also delight to have this lecture. Honor because it's a Saracci, lecture, and we all know that Rodolfo, has been a really influential and prominent epidemiologist and public health practitioner, let's say, who has influenced generations of epidemiologists just like myself. And also it's a great delight because I have a personal history with this, let's say, school. So it was in 2008. This is the group photo of the, 21st edition of this. And this is me. And this is me after 15 years. So you can see the big difference is that I have lost a bit of hair. And apart from that, yeah, I'm still excited about epidemiology and science. And today I would like to talk about green space and health, which has become a quite trendy topic, especially in the field of environmental epidemiology recently. As you can see here in this graph, since especially 2013, 2014, it has been, a massive increase in the number of publications on this topic. And I can remember in 2012, I was trying to put together, a session on green space and health in the, annual conference of International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, and it was so difficult to find enough number of, green space-related abstracts to put together a session. And nowadays, this ISE conference, we have 2 or 3 sessions on this topic. Still, it's very difficult to select among very nice, let's say, abstracts that we receive. So it has been a massive change. And this, apart from the, gold rush that, that has occurred, that, people have data, core data, cross-sectional data, and green space is another exposure, another paper. Apart from that, there has been some reasons behind this, As you know, the world is urbanizing. Currently more than half of the world population are living in the urban areas, and by 2050, almost 2/3 of people will be living in urban areas where people are often have less access to green space and natural environment in general. So this topic of urban health is becoming more and more, important and trendy. At the same time, the climate is changing. And you know that, green spaces and, this idea of nature-based solutions have been, suggested to be one of the main tools for both mitigation and adaptation strategies. And at the same time, there are more funding available. For example, European Commission has invested quite a bit of funding for research on these nature-based solutions and, green spaces and their health and well-being effects. So all these, have helped to move this field forward. And yes, and then I would like to start to see why we think that green spaces are beneficial, The mechanisms are to be established, but mainly we can categorize these mechanisms in 3 categories. They can reduce harm by, for example, reduction in major urban-related environmental hazards, just like air pollution, noise, and heat. They can also have restorative effect, just like attention restoration and also stress reduction. These are the main, let's say, the 2 well-established mechanisms of health effects of green spaces. And then also they can build capacity and inspiration, which, for example, they can promote physical activity, social interaction, social cohesion, and all these can be translated into the better health and well-being. So I'm going to, start from pregnancy outcomes, which is the beginning of the life, and then I end with the mortality, which is the end of the life. Yeah. So I'm going through the all life stages and what we know. In one of the, very first studies on the effects of, green spaces on pregnancy outcome, what we did in my course, that is, led by Jordi Sunier, who was a teacher here, and also Martin, who is sitting there. So these are, 4 birth cohorts across different regions of the Spain with different, climates. And what we did, we assessed the amount of greenness, around their maternal residential addresses. And then we saw that those mothers who were living in the greener areas, whose babies, had higher birth weight and also higher head circumference. So, and then we continued this study in the Bourne and Bradford cohort in England. And the beauty of this cohort is that half of this cohort is white British, women, and so half of them are Pakistani origin mothers. So it's a very unique cohort in the sense that you can look at the effect modification by ethnicity. Again, we saw that higher residential surrounding green space was associated with higher birth weight. But the striking, finding was that, while for white British mother, we could see evidence of the, this association. For Pakistani origin mothers, the association was almost null, so no association, which was quite striking to see, such ethnicity can play a big role here. Also, green space, just to summarize, the exposure to green space is quite complex. It's not like air pollution that you just breathe, or it's not like noise that you just hear, It has different aspects, and different aspects are associated with different mechanisms. For example, one that has been used most widely is the surrounding green space. So it's a green space around home, around workplace, around schools, or around any point of interest. But also, it's important access to green space. So how far you live from a green space, for example, or how far the school or workplace is from a green space. Another one is the actual use of green spaces, yeah? And another aspect is visual access to green spaces, because it has, restorative effect and all that. And also, indoor green, so plant pots and all that. What are the effects? So, for example, in this study, and another thing that I would like to mention, that up to now, most of the studies on the green space and health are coming from the high-income countries. So we don't have much evidence in low and middle-income countries, and we do need more and more evidence from those countries. For example, in this study that we did in Iran, which is a middle-income country, for the first time we look at the association of visual access to green space and also use of green space during pregnancy and number of plant pots. And then we saw that more visual access to green space through the window of home, and also more use of green spaces were also associated with higher birth weight. And there are plenty of studies published on this topic. This is a meta-analysis, and it's clearly showed that more residential surrounding greenness is associated with higher birth weight. For pregnancy complications, just like gestational diabetes, or just preeclampsia or pregnancy-induced hypertensive disorders in general, the evidence is still limited, but it's suggestive for a protective effect. And also, I would like to also touch upon some, let's say, reproductive also health and outcomes. For example, in this study that, again, we conducted in Iran, we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with more ovarian reserve as measured by the anti-Mullerian hormone. And also, in this another study that we conducted in Northern Europe, among Scandinavian women, we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with lower perimenstrual syndrome, the symptoms of the perimenstrual syndrome. And also, in another pan-European study that we conducted over 20 years of follow-up, we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with decelerated reproductive aging and older age at menopause. So let's now move on to the child health. So, this is a really nice book by Edward Wilson. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. So it's not a, let's say, scientific book. It's more of a self-journey. And here in this book, he proposes that, we Homo sapiens have evolved in nature. So we need to nature to thrive, and we have evolutionary bond to nature. Based on that, other authors, postulated that, our children, they need to raise up in nature, and, nature has a very important and crucial role in especially brain development in children. Earlier studies on this topic were mainly experimental studies, looking at the short-term effects of exposure to green spaces on children with some neurodevelopmental problems, just like ADHD or attentional disorders. So For example, I mean, Taylor and Co, they did it quite nice studies on this topic, beautiful studies. And for example, in this study, they took some of, I mean, about around 20 children with attention deficit disorder to play in indoor, environments, also built outdoor and green outdoor. And they saw that, when the children play in green outdoor, they had better attentional, let's say, performance compared to when they play indoor or in built environment. Here, it's the same study. I mean, when the children played in the room without any window, they had the most severe symptom after playing. But by just having a window towards green, the symptoms, the severity reduced. And then the least severe symptoms were when the children played in the open green space, let's say. But, then, maybe since this study, we have started to look at the long-term effects of green spaces on, let's say, general population children, and then how it affects their brain development or neurodevelopment. For example, in this study we conducted in Barcelona, we recruited 2,500 children from 40 schools across Barcelona. So we assessed the amount of greenness around their home, around their school, and also we asked the parents to report, okay, how much time your child plays in the green spaces or in blue spaces, which is in our context is the beach. And we saw that, higher time playing in the green spaces or, playing in the beach was associated with lower total difficulty scores and also lower emotional problems and lower peer relationship problem, and also they were associated with more pro-social behavior, which is a behavioral strength. We saw more or less the same associations for residential surrounding greenness and a bit for the school. And then we followed this study in Germany, in a study led by Iana Merkovich, and we saw the same pattern. So more residential surrounding green space was associated with lower behavioral problems in children. Then what we did, we followed this study by another study in the INMA court in Sabadell and Valencia. And then, what we did, we assessed the lifelong exposure to green spaces from birth to age 7. And at age 4, we did the Connors-Kiddy continuous performance task. And at age 7, we did the attentional network task. And we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness across the life, postnatal obviously, was associated with lower inattentiveness or better attentional function, let's put it that way. But in a study which is one of my favorite studies, what we wanted to look at how green space could affect the cognitive development. So what we did in that sample of 2,500 children in the 40 schools across Barcelona, and this was part of the Jordi Sunier's ERC grant. What we did, we went to the schools at 4 times every 3 months. So over 1 year, and then we did the repeated computerized test of the cognitive function, in this case, working memory and attention. And so for each child, we could have the trajectory of, let's say, cognitive development over a period of 1 year. Here, each point is 1 visit, as you can see. So this is a trajectory over 12 months. And then these are the children in terms of the working memory, superior working memory. And these are the children who were going to the greenest school. So tertile tree of the school greenness. And these are the children who were going to the least greenest school. And you can see the difference is quite striking when you look at it, just by going to the greener school. And then we also planted air pollution monitors within those schools, and we saw that about 20, depending on the association, about 20 to 60% of this association could be mediated through the reduction in exposure to air pollution. So then what we did, in a subsample of 253 of these children, we did a brain MRI. And then we reconstructed all the green spaces since birth till the time of acquiring the MRI. And then we saw that, lifelong exposure to green space was associated with enhancement in some parts of the prefrontal cortex. And as you may know, prefrontal cortex is what makes us as human beings, high order of thinking and, morality and all that. And also some, enhancement in paramotor cortex. We also, in the white matter, we also saw some enhancement in the prefrontal paramotor cortex, and also big, let's say, cluster in the cerebellum, as you can see here. And then what we did, since for these children, we also had the cognitive test performance. We mapped them on the brain. You can see the red parts are the ones that are associated with cognitive performance. The green ones are the parts that are associated with green space, and the yellow ones are the overlaps. So the parts that were associated with green spaces were overlapping with the parts that were associated with better cognitive performance. And we did a regression analysis, looking at how these parts that were associated with green space, how do they fare against, the performance in the cognitive test. So, I mean, to summarize, what we saw was that green space was associated with some anatomical changes in the brain that were beneficial in terms of cognitive function. So it's kind of a biophilia when you think about it. So it's not only neurodevelopment, it's also mental health. For example, in this beautiful, population-based study conducted in Denmark, they look at the lifelong exposure to.
I'm sorry, you have to hold the microphone up.
Okay. Yeah. No. Yes. So in this beautiful study, they look at the effect of the green spaces on a wide range of mental health disorders in the children and adolescents. And as you can see, for most of the outcomes, just like eating disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, mood disorders, even schizophrenia, and also substance and alcohol abuse, there was an protective association between green space and these outcomes. So there are quite a number of, currently systematic reviews and meta-analyses on this association between mental health and, green spaces in children, and most of them are suggesting, a beneficial association. So let's move on to the physical health. In this, I really like this study that was conducted in Finland. So, whenever you talk about green spaces, especially in the policy-making sphere, people who don't want to, go for more green solution, they say, oh, green spaces is about allergy, and we don't want that. And this is something that you hear. But I can tell you that, the association is so complex, and the, let's say, association between green spaces and allergy and asthma and all that is quite complex. So it's quite heterogeneous. Some of the studies are showing beneficial associations. Some of the studies are showing no association, and some are showing, even harmful associations. For example, in this beautiful study, what they did, they look at the, the land use type where the child was raised. Agriculture or, rural land against the, let's say, more urban land use type. And then what they saw was that, those children who were in the more natural land, who were raised in the more natural landscape, they had a better skin microbiota and more enriched in terms of the Acinetobacter and Gamma Proteobacter, which was then translated to lower systemic inflammation and atopia. And as I said, this is a quite heterogeneous, association. For example, in this study conducted in New York, they saw that, higher street trees in the residential area of the child was associated with lower prevalence of asthma. The same team in the same city, in another study, they saw the opposite. They saw that it is increasing the risk of these allergic, outcomes. And it can be context specific. For example, in this nice study conducted by Ellen Fortes and her colleagues, they look at this association between residential surrounding greenness and allergic rhinitis and a range of other allergic outcomes. As you can see, there is a massive heterogeneity here. While for some cohorts, we can see some sort of protective effects. For other cohorts, we can see some sort of harmful effects. And then the meta-analysis, the association was totally null. So context really matters here, And it's not only about context, it's also about the type of green space. For example, in this study that we conducted in Sabadell, it's a town next to Barcelona, we recruited 3,000 children, and we saw that while living next to a forest, was associated with lower risk of obesity and also sedentary behavior. It didn't increase the risk of asthma and allergy conditions. But but proximity to a park was the opposite, let's say, had the opposite pattern. So we saw no effect on sedentary behavior and physical and obesity, but we saw an increased risk of asthma and allergic outcomes. So the type of green space may play a role here. So talking about the sedentary behavior and physical activity, the association between green spaces and physical activity is still heterogeneous. And I think a part of it is because up to now, most studies have looked at only the presence or abundance of the green space rather than the quality. And the quality is really important. For example, if you have a park next to you, but it's not safe to go, then you don't let your child to play there anyway. So, but studies are quite consistent when it comes to children who were playing, who are at the green space, showing that when the children are within green space, they are more likely to engage in moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is what you expect. And the same for obesity and body mass index. So as you can see, although the studies are suggestive for an inverse association between greenness and obesity, but still the association is not there. For BMI, is, at least based on this meta-analysis, is significant, but we can see quite a bit of heterogeneity here. About other cardiometabolic risk factors, for example, in these pioneering studies by Iana, she saw that in two bears courses across Germany, they saw that higher exposure to green space was associated with lower blood pressure at 10 years of age. In the same cohorts, however, they didn't see any association with the blood lipid levels. And another cohort study in Netherlands, they also didn't find much of association between residential surrounding greenness and cardiometabolic risk factors. However, in a population-based study in Iran, what we saw that more time spent playing in green spaces, especially in the natural green spaces, just like wood, was associated with lower blood glucose level and also lower risk of impaired fasting glucose. So to finish this childhood period, something that is very important here is that childhood is a period when also we are shaping the behaviors. Yeah. For example, in this study, what we saw was that more use of green spaces and more affinity to green spaces during the childhood can spill over to the adulthood, and those who had more affinity to nature in the childhood and those who use more nature during the childhood were more likely to use it in the adulthood, and they were less likely to be depressed in the adulthood. So let's move on to the adults' health. In this beautiful and groundbreaking study that was published in Science in 1984, what they did, they randomized the post-surgical patients into two types of rooms. Rooms with window to a wall and rooms with the window with green, with the green access, let's say, visual access to green space. And they saw that those patients who were in the room with the green view, they were, let's say, they spent less time in the hospital and they had much better recovery, let's say, compared to those patients who were in the room that were facing wall. And also those patients with green view, they asked for less analgesics, so they experienced less pain, just by visual access to green space, imagine. In terms of the mental health, is one of the, let's say, it's one of the areas that we have more evidence, more convincing evidence, and we can have conclusion that long-term exposure to green and in this case blue spaces is associated with improved mental health. So in terms of both perceived mental health and also psychological problems and disorders, just like depression, anxiety, and also, for example, in this study that we did in Catalonia, what we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with lower visits to mental health specialists, lower risk of use of tranquilizers, antidepressants, and sleep medications. Another study that we conducted in Barcelona, we saw that more green space was associated with better perceived general health, and about half of this association could be mediated through better perceived social support, better mental health, and more physical activity. And so green space is not only about cognitive development in children, and also it is about the cognitive performance during the adulthood. There are studies showing that the higher residential surrounding greenness or greenness surrounding the workplace is associated with better cognitive performance in the adult. Also, it is about the, let's say, physical health. In this really pioneering study by Yolanda Maas and her colleagues in Netherlands, what they did, they look at around 3,500 participants. They look at their GP visits the doctor visits, and they associated this to residential surrounding greenness, and they saw the lower risk of a range of, let's say, physical health outcomes, just like cardiovascular problems, musculoskeletal problems, and neurological problems, and respiratory problems. So I can say that up to now, one of the most convincing evidence for adults in terms of the green space and physical health is for cardiovascular conditions. And as you can see in this very recent meta-analysis that we did, we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular mortality and also ischemic heart disease mortality, and also cerebrovascular disease mortality, and even a stroke incidence. And also it's about other cardiometabolic conditions just like diabetes. For example, in these systematic reviews, they concluded that higher residential surrounding greenness is associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Also, they are associated with lower risk of sedentary behavior and all that. And also it's about the hypertension. Again, the context matter here. For example, in this study that we conducted in Barcelona and Brussels, we did differential pattern. For example, for Barcelona, we saw that access to green space was associated with lower risk of hypertension, which was not the case for Brussels. But for both in the elder population, we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with lower risk of hypertension. This is, another study that we conducted in the Whitehall cohort in England. And over a period of 15 years of follow-up, we saw, an inverse association or protective association between residential surrounding greenness and the incidence of metabolic syndrome. Regarding the cancer, the association is quite mixed. So while for some cancer, just like skin cancer, there is a harmful association reported between green space and cancer. For other cancer, just like more, let's say, hormone-dependent cancer, just like prostate cancer and breast cancer, there are studies showing that there is a protective association. But I must say, this is one of the areas that it's not that conclusive when it comes to green spaces. And a part of it is because it's difficult, especially when you look at the rural areas, it's difficult to separate the effect of green spaces from pesticides and all those kind of things that they can come in, So it's a bit tricky here. So it's also about healthy aging. We are having aging population in many parts of the world, including Europe, and also at the same time, it's coinciding, as I said, with urbanization. So we have more aging, elderly, we are going to have more elderly in urban areas who have less access to green space. And yeah, there are studies, although, it's growing, but it's still limited, that, more exposure to green space during the elderly is associated with better quality of life, better self-perceived general health and mental health, and also a decelerated cognitive decline and physical functioning decline and lower risk of, let's say, dementia. For example, in this study that we conducted in Whitehall cohort in England, I mean, we followed the participant over 10 years period, and we saw that, and we measure, I mean, we used the data on 3 repeated measurements of the cognitive function. We saw that the higher residential surrounding greenness was associated with decelerated cognitive decline in this cohort. Also, you know, it's about the physical functioning. In the same cohort, we look at the association between green spaces and physical functioning, and we saw that higher residential surrounding greenness is associated with decelerated physical functioning, both upper physical functioning, which is based on the grip strength, and also lower physical function, which was based on walking speed. And yes, it's about also mortality. In this really beautiful and seminal study by Rich Mitchell from University of Glasgow and Frank Boham, what they did it's an ecological study, but it's really beautiful. But what they did, they looked at the level of green spaces at enumeration districts in England, on all the enumeration districts in England, and also they quantified the greenness in those enumeration districts. And here you can see the higher the greenness, the lower the mortality risk, which what you would expect. But the beauty of a study to me, which I like, is this one. So what they did, they also further stratified this based on the income group. So the reference are let's say that the most affluent group is the reference. And then these are the less affluent group or more deprived group. And then you can see this is the massive difference in the mortality risk between the most deprived and least deprived group. Yeah. These are the people who were living in the neighborhoods with the least amount of green space. Yeah, and then when we move to the people who were living in the, let's say, neighborhoods with the most green space, you can see the difference is much smaller. So green spaces were were reducing the income inequality in health, so they have ecogenic effect, and that's why I really like this study. And yes, I mean, mortality is one of the outcomes that we have really convincing evidence, and that higher exposure to green spaces is associated with lower risk of mortality, especially the cardiovascular mortality. And yes, can come and plant more trees. And thanks, yeah.